What's going on, everybody? I'm Lou Orlando, New York Sirens beat reporter for PWHL Now and Sportsnaut. It's my first year covering the team. I've been meaning to start doing some more video stuff, so we're going to give this a whirl. I've got a recurring column called Siren Sounds, and I'll take a bunch of different stuff from the week. It could be like practice, post-game stuff, it could be on ice, storylines, and I'll jam it all together into one big piece. That's what I want to do here just in video form. I think, number one, it's an opportunity to get into some conversations that aren't so black and white revolving the team. And number two, I think it gives us a chance to, and gives me a chance to really dive deeper into stuff that sometimes you can't always break down as in depth on the writing side. So, especially as New York's in the thick of this, it looks to be a pretty tight playoff race over the next couple months. And even looking ahead to the offseason this summer, which, if they do add 4 teams in expansion, that's going to be pretty chaotic and tumultuous in its own way. I think better to get this started now rather than later. So we'll call it Siren Sounds. That name can always be subject to change, but it works for now. And I think probably as good a time to start as any. There's a lot to break down. I'd like to start with the game on Sunday, and then we can work our way forward through the week. But yeah, listen, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that Sunday's game, that 6-2 win over Ottawa, is one of the biggest wins in franchise history. And I think certainly from the lens of what it could mean for this team and this fan base moving forward. But to even put aside the record crowd for just a second, that game had some extra stakes coming in. New York's on a 5-game losing streak. With a win, they can jump back into a playoff spot. They had gotten leapfrogged by Ottawa earlier in the week, and the Sirens had been in the playoff spot for 2 consecutive months, basically since the start of the new year. So, that game, I think no matter what, was going to have a little bit of an edge, just considering all of that. But when 8,264 people file into Prudential Center, and you set a team home attendance record, and the upper bowl was open, it was going to have a big game feel. There's I think a spot-on tweet from this account, Crease Giants, which, if you're on the app and you're looking for people that do PWHL content and analysis, I think he's one of the best out there. And he said, if you're going to set a home attendance record, you got to show up. The Sirens showed up, man. No question about it. 6 goals, that ties a team record. You get this explosive performance from your superstar, right? Sarah Fillier, 2 goals, 3 points. And just even from a game perspective, the game is fun and exciting. There's a lot of high-flying action. I thought the quality of play was crisp and a step up from what we had seen through the first 2 games out of the Olympic break. Definitely that first one against Montreal, where New York comes out super sloppy. So I thought the pace of play and the quality of play was at a super high level. And to me, what excited me, and I hope excited the fans that were in attendance, was how physical and chippy that game was. And, that's something that when I watch new people fall in love with hockey or start to discover the sport, and they start to see how much physicality there is and how much you could get away with without getting a penalty, that in almost any other sport, if you started shoving someone after a whistle or after the play was over, you'd surely get a penalty or maybe even kicked from the game. And in hockey, there's just such a higher threshold for that stuff. And to me, that's what made Sunday's game so exciting, was you had that physicality, you had that chippiness, but not too many penalties to the point where the game slows down and it takes away from what's actually happening on the ice. So, put yourself in the shoes of whether, you were a new hockey fan at that game that was going to your first hockey game or one of your first hockey games, or whether you're someone that you like hockey, but maybe you haven't gone to a ton of Sirens games yet and you're on the fence about, should I be going to more games? And you go to a game like that, and again, offense on display, the game's exciting. I don't see why you wouldn't want to come back to more games. That feels like a perfect game to draw someone new in, and where they might go, all right, that was really fun. I got to go back. I got to see what this is all about. I got to give this another shot. And that's what you hope for when you have a record attendance. There are a couple moments that I think about, and I try to be careful about comparing anything to like a playoff atmosphere. Because especially in hockey, if you know anything about playoff hockey, if you've watched it really at any level, NHL, PWHL, if you want to go juniors, college hockey, right? Playoff hockey has a distinct feel. And so get a little carried away with comparing regular season games to playoff games. And I'm not going to do that. It's not like, from start to finish, that game had a playoff game vibe. But there were moments in that game where at least I kind of took a step back and went, oh my, this crowd has a little extra juice and this game has a little extra feel. I think about Maddie Wheeler's goal in the first period to open the scoring and the crowd pop that hit after she gives New York a 1-0 lead. The other moment I think of is in the middle of the second period, Kristyna Kaltounkova, when she gets that double minor for roughing after that scrum behind the Ottawa net, and she's skating into the penalty box, and the crowd erupts as she's walking in and sitting down, and you even see her kind of look up and for a second just take it all in. Those are two moments that have really stuck with me the entire week as, okay, that felt different. That felt different than just your typical Sirens game. I had a little bit of an inkling that it was going to be different coming in. I had gotten a text from a source that morning that there were going to be at least 7,000 people in the building. For context, the previous record is 5,132. That's in April 2024, the first game at the Rock during that inaugural season. So, 7,000 is already a pretty good leap. But again, it ends up being over 8,000. It ends up being 3,000 more than the previous record. So in a lot of ways, that's a statement. The other moment that I think of is, I missed my path train. I usually get to games like an hour and a half before puck drop. I got there closer to 11, and I'm walking up to the arena, and I see that long line down Mulberry Street. And that was a new sight for me. I think it was a new sight for a lot of fans that were maybe waiting in that line. Right, a couple little things early on that make you go, all right, this game's going to have a different feel. And it had a tangible impact on the ice. I talked to Greg Fargo on Wednesday, and he was like, oh, 100%. We fed off of it. He's like, getting those early goals in the first period and getting the crowd riled up. He's like, that powered us through the whole game. I think the other thing to think of, and he made sure to make note of this, is if you've been to Siren games before this season, a lot of times the lower bowl isn't packed like that. It's not packed on both sides. And what the Sirens do is they put fans behind the benches and behind the nets. Why? Because that's where the PWHL broadcast cameras are pointed. And if the game's on TV, you want people to see that there are fans in the building. So the other side of that is literally on the other side of the rink, a lot of times there's a lot of empty seats. Now, they'll put some people right up against the glass, opposite the benches. But for the most part, you're looking at a lot of empty rows of seats. And talking to Greg Fargo on Wednesday, he went, we're used to hearing them. You'll hear the fans behind you, but you don't really see anything across the rink. And he's like, it was different and special on Sunday. He's like, not only could we hear the fans, you're looking across the rink and you could see fans go all the way up the lower bowl. And it's, the lower bowl was pretty packed. The upper bowl was pretty well populated. They had the upper bowl open on the side where the benches are. So, right, that ends up being a pretty cool moment for a New York team that struggled with attendance through its first 2.5 years. I think, first of all, what fed into this? Number one, this didn't come out of nowhere. The Sirens have steadily been on the rise attendance-wise. Really good stat by Kyle Cushman online. If you compare the first 10 home games of this season to the first 10 home games of last season, it's a jump of over 11,000 in gross attendance. That's a pretty good sign of progress, again, especially when you look at how tough the numbers have been through the first 2.5 seasons. There are a couple big things at play, I think. Number one is the Olympics. There's been a big Olympic boom within the PWHL, really across the league. But, New York, they've got that big MSG game coming up on April 4th. That didn't sell out until after the Olympics. their attendance and their season tickets have gone up since the Olympics. I think it really helped that not only did USA dominate on the women's side, but they go toe-to-toe with Canada, and you get this battle of current PWHL stars, right? You're going up against Poulin and Fillier and all these big names, but you've also got potentially future PWHL stars that are on this big stage. And I'm sure many of you have already seen, like, look at how big of a following KK Harvey and Layla Edwards and Abby Murphy have. That to have that be an element as well, I think that all came together in this perfect storm where people came back from the Olympics, fans came from watching the Olympics and went, oh, now I'm a little invested. I kind of want to see where these players go. And if that's following the college ones back to their respective colleges, if that's following a player that you really liked back to their team, if you're just, I'm going to check out the league and see where the chips fall. You know, I think it's added more eyeballs and more interest to the league. So that's the big one. But I think another part of this equation, and it shouldn't get overlooked, is look at New York's team success this year and compare it to what kind of went down in the past couple seasons. Like, obviously, New York finishes last in the league in the first two seasons. If you think back to last year and last March, well, New York goes on a 9-game losing streak from January to March. And in a 30-game season, that's really tough to overcome. And that's one of the big reasons they didn't make the playoffs last year. The year before that, well, not only did they finish dead last, but they also had no permanent home. And they're bouncing back and forth between Bridgeport in Connecticut and UBS on Long Island and The Rock towards the end of the season where they get a couple games there. You know, that's not exactly a formula for sustaining and building a fan community. They get into Prudential as a permanent home last season. But again, I think, you know, team success can drive a lot of in-person and just interest in general. And to have not only a team that's in the thick of a playoff race and currently holds a playoff spot right now, but to have this exciting rookie class and a group of rookies that have already, I think, really connected with this fan base. And you look at how big of a fan base Kaltounkova has and how big of a fan base Casey O'Brien has. Like, those are, I think, big, you know, big players that are maybe creating more of an interest around this team. But the fact that this team is in the thick of a playoff race and the culture feels better, the vibes from inside the locker room, I'm told, from players feel better. So I think that all comes together and creates a little bit more interest, and it translates to more in-person attendance with the fans. We've seen numerous weeknight records for attendance already set post the Olympic break. The latest one was over 3,700. So you're seeing attendance on the rise here. Now, obviously, Sunday was the big statement, but this has been something that's gradually building. The bigger question is, how sustainable is it? I think with the Olympic boom, we're really not going to know for a lot of time. Like, you know, are people going to taper out? How many people are going to stick full time from a pretty crazy Olympics that became a sensationalized, pretty big deal? And with the team success, you know, it's tough because I think it's hard to project for any team what way they're trending, positive or negative. Again, with 4 teams potentially joining the league next summer in expansion, you really have no idea what any team's going to look like next season. So, you know, if we were just in a normal league and it wasn't expanding next year, you would look at New York and say, look at all this rookie talent that they have, that they can build on. And you use that as, that's a great marketing tool. Look how good we were with these rookies. Look how good Kaltounkova and O'Brien and Maddie Wheeler already are. And think about how good it's going to be in future years. But unfortunately, you have no idea how much of this rookie class is really going to be with this team, even next year and beyond. So I think that makes those two factors a little tough to predict moving forward. And even just down the stretch this season, you know, the one thing that works against New York is they don't really have a ton of home games moving forward. They got 11 games left this season, starting with this Sunday coming up against Minnesota. It's a takeover tour game in Denver. Out of those 11 games, only 3 at home and only 2 at Prudential Center. Now, the other one is that MSG game, which we know has sold out, and that's going to be a big deal. It's projected to set the United States professional women's hockey attendance record. So that's going to be a big, feather in their cap. The two Prudential Center games are weekday games. They're Wednesday night games, April 1st against Minnesota, April 15th against Toronto. Historically, the Sirens have not done great with weeknight attendance. Now, as I said earlier, recently they've set a couple records. It was 3,500 and then over 3,700. So what are you looking for in those last two weeknight games? I think at least 3,500 is a good sign that your fan numbers are either treading water or even rising. If one of those games breaks 4,000, I think that's a really good sign of progress for a weeknight game. And then obviously the MSG game is going to draw a lot of eyes, and it's going to be a spectacle. It's going to be a big event. Don't overlook this Sunday's game, because I think there is an element to that MSG game of, again, it's a spectacle. It's going to be a big deal. It's going to be the first game at professional women's hockey game at MSG with a crowd. I think you're going to draw people that might not even show up there with any intention of following the league closely moving forward. And that's right. You just want to get people in the building and maybe win them over. But I do think there's going to be a lot of people in the building it's just a big event. And it feels like maybe a place to be. To get over 8,000 people at Prudential Center for, not just an average regular season game, because it was International Women's Day. Gotham FC dropped the puck. Ali Krieger's in the building. They had special events lined up. There was more of a draw to that game. I'm not going to just throw it aside and say, hey, just your typical game and 8,000 people showed up. There was certainly, I think, an element of a little extra draw with everything that was going on around that game. But to get 8,000 people in Prudential Center, keep in mind, this is a team that really has struggled with attendance. And I do think, from my perspective, that there's been conversations about the Sirens' attendance that have not been had in good faith. But the fact of the matter is that when you're in a New York market, and not only a New York market, but a New York market that's thrived with women's sports, and, look no further than the Liberty in the WNBA, and Gotham in the NWSL, right? That this is a market that has a lot of times stood out as a really good place for women's sports to thrive. The fact that New York's attendance has struggled, and there are plenty of factors that contribute to it that I've already mentioned, but at the end of the day, the fact that it's struggled through 2.5 seasons is going to be a big deal. It's going to be something that's noteworthy, and it's going to be something that's talked about. Is it anything that, I don't believe for a second that the league ever pondered moving New York and relocating because of the attendance issues. I think you'd be foolish to abandon the New York market, especially with expansion on the horizon. But to see New York go through the first 2 seasons and average less than 3,000 fans at their home games, that's eye-opening, and it's something that both the Sirens and the league want to improve. So to see New York finally cross that 3,000 average threshold, and that's only going to go up with the MSG game, I think there's a lot of positives there. And the big thing that could work in their favor is if they can lock down a playoff spot. And then even if you're the 4 seed, and you won't have home games the first 2, you're guaranteed at least 1 home game in a playoff series. And I'm curious to see what those attendance numbers would look like. I think that could, in a lot of ways, especially in the wake of that MSG game, which should draw a lot of new eyeballs onto this team, I think you could see a decent crowd in any playoff game that they host at The Rock. So that's just, I think, something to keep an eye on moving forward. One thing I do want to note, and it's a credit to the Sirens and their organization and their leadership with how they've handled some of these attendance discussions, is, I think there's a way. Obviously, the Sirens want more attendance, and I've talked to Greg Fargo, the head coach, and a few of the players about this, and clearly they want to play in front of fans. That's part of the dream about being a professional athlete. It's getting to play on a big stage in front of a lot of fans. But I think there's a way where you could talk about some of your attendance issues and maybe either complain or talk about it in a way that might come off as ungrateful to the fans that you already have. And I think it's a major credit to the Sirens that they've been able to toe that line of, hey, clearly we want new fans, we want to expand our fan base, we want to build it, but at every turn, they've made a point to thank and show gratitude to the fans that they do have, and the fans that have been going to games consistently. I think of, and I'll read it here, I got this quote from the captain, Micah Zandy Hart, post-game, when we're talking about the crowd and everything and all the emotions post-game, and she goes, obviously we wanted to have a game like that, but I think our fans that have been at every game deserve that too. And that has been a lot of the messaging that we've gotten from the Sirens this season. I think of a time when I talked to Greg Fargo midway through the season, right after the MSG game got announced, and he said, we're hoping that will be something that helps build our fan base, but, we really love the fans that we do have. They're passionate, they're dedicated, they're loyal. Those are the three words that I hear a lot from the Sirens organization when they talk about their fan base, even though, everyone in that building knows what the attendance numbers looks like. I think that's just a really good job. I think that can be a hard line to toe sometimes, is advocating for new fans and trying to get more interest, but doing it in a way that doesn't diminish the fan base that you already do have. And I think that's the fact that they've been able to pull that line off and go out of their way to be grateful to the fans that are already in the building. I think that's a good sign for the community moving forward. I think that's the way you really build a fan base and get them to rally around you. So it's a credit to Fargo. It's a credit to Zandy Hart. That was something that stood out to me, as that was not only a mature outlook. I thought that was perfect PR. So again, you got those 3 home games coming up: Wednesday, April 1st, the April 4th MSG game, and then April 15th against Toronto. And then if you can make a playoffs, that's where I think maybe you'll see the culmination of a lot of this progress on the attendance side. So is it sustainable? Listen, there's a lot of, to sum it up quickly, right? There's a lot of balls in the air still. There's a lot of questions that we're not really going to have answered even at the end of this season. But I think you're seeing some really promising signs of progress in that respect. Let's talk about some of the stuff in-game. I think the biggest in-game storyline, well, there's a few, but to me it's Sarah Fillier. Because Fillier comes in and into that game on Sunday, and it's 14 games without a goal, and she's got a 1.7 shooting percentage, which was dead last among any PWHL player with at least 1 goal this season. So now she'd been incredibly productive offensively. If you've gone to any of the games, if you've watched her, she's still their top playmaker. She's second in the league in assists. Like, she was still having an impact offensively. But it was strange to see someone that historically has been not just an elite point producer, but an elite goal scorer, someone that scored 13 as a rookie last year and won Rookie of the Year in that incredible season. It's a little strange to see someone struggle with the puck luck that she had. The puck luck was not a problem on Sunday. She has that great goal in the first period. It's really created by Casey O'Brien, takes it coast to coast, wraps around the net, and then Fillier just crashes the net and gets that goal in the crease, and then she picks up the empty netter at the end of the game, but she also had a really good assist with Casey O'Brien on Taylor Gerard's power play goal. So, Fillier looked in prime form. I think you had the sense that, again, this is not someone that was going to shoot 1.7% the entire season. And when you look at what she did at the Olympics with Team Canada, when she was clearly one of their best players, and she was on really Canada's best line at the Olympics with Daryl Watts and Marie-Philip Poulin, that, okay, you had a sense that maybe a stronger second half surge was coming for Fillier. But to see it break through like that, that's a really reassuring sign, because, listen, New York's gotten a lot of really good production from its rookies, but I'm always a little skeptical about how sustainable is rookie scoring. And even now, we've seen it's been 3 straight games without a goal for Kaltounkova. I'm not raising any panic alarms. I just think, scoring in general, goal scoring is a tough thing to do consistently, and it's one of those stats that is super variable. Highly variable even. And with rookies, I think that's exponentially so, because they're adjusting to the league, and they'll go through hot stretches and they'll go through cold stretches. So, even though Fillier is technically a second-year player, you're talking about someone that her freshman year of college at Princeton was in 2018. She's 25 years old. She's played extensively at the international level. this is a very experienced second-year forward. And it's someone that you can rely on, I think, for offensive production consistently, and now you're looking for that goal production consistently as well. I do want to go through, she said some really interesting stuff throughout the week, and we had a fun interaction post-game as well. And, I asked her, does it feel like a relief after all the puck luck that you've had to finally see 2 goals go in the net? Is that a little bit of a weight lifted off your shoulders?
Yeah, I think I took your article personally. No, I'm just kidding.
And I had written an article earlier in that week. I published it on Saturday about her goal-scoring drought and how she wasn't panicking. And so that was a fun moment post-game. She laughs about it. It gets a good chuckle from the room. But I'm a firm believer that behind every joke is at least a little bit of truth. And while I don't think that Sarah Fillier was particularly offended or motivated by when I talked to her earlier that week or the posting of my article on Saturday, I do think that's a player that did not want to come off the ice after practice on a Tuesday and have to talk about how she isn't scoring goals this season. I guarantee you this is someone that really hasn't had to answer questions like that. And I went back and I pulled some of the stats. She never went more than 8 games without a goal last season. In her collegiate career at Princeton, she never went more than 5 games without a goal. So you're talking about someone that has been one of, if not the best player on her teams at every level, including not just the PWHL, but at the Olympic level. At best on best play, she's consistently been one of Canada's top scorers, if not their top scorer. So this is someone that hasn't had a lot of point production droughts. And so, again, while I don't think she was offended, I can tell you with a lot of certainty that those are questions that she doesn't want to have to answer. And I'll take you through some of the stuff that she said Tuesday, because I'm always interested in getting inside the mind of a superstar athlete, because they've experienced almost unfathomable levels of success throughout their career, and it's interesting to see how that molds them at the professional stage. So when I talked to her on Tuesday, the precursor to this is I had talked to Greg Fargo right before the Olympic break in January, and her goal drought was probably around 10 games or so at the time, and again, she was still producing offensively with the assists. Talking to Fargo, and I was like, it doesn't look like she's pressing. Are you getting that sense? And he was like, oh yeah, no one's hitting the panic button, certainly not her. But I was curious to get her perspective on that. So I kind of throw all that in front of her, and she very quickly was like, yeah, definitely not panicking. And, made sure to remind me that, I've still got however many assists she had at the time of that interview. She was second in the league at the time. I'm still producing offensively. And then she starts to go into what I found to be a pretty mature perspective about everything. About, one of my greatest skill sets is being able to set people up to score. And I don't really care how I get the points. If I'm passing and that's how the points are coming, as long as we're getting the 3 points in the standings, as long as we're getting the wins, that's all that I really care about. Which is a super mature outlook. And honestly, kind of what I expected someone like Sarah Fillier to say. But at the very end of our talk last Tuesday, she just threw a couple lines in there that kind of stuck in my head. And she goes, but I do know there's more in me offensively. I definitely have more to show. I'd like to show that in the second half. I'm paraphrasing, but that was essentially the message. And I think, that's a really probably encapsulates the mindset of a superstar. You got the initial, listen, I'm definitely not panicking, and think about how good you have to be. That you can go 14 straight games without a goal and be able to confidently tell yourself, listen, it's not me, it's not my skill talent that's the problem. I'm okay. This is just, it's bad luck, it's hockey. It's not like I've suddenly lost my skills. You gotta be a pretty confident athlete to go 14 games without a goal and still feel like, listen, we're not panicking, I'm still a good hockey player. And then you get the very mature answer about winning, and a lot of these athletes, especially in hockey, are just completely obsessed with winning. And at the end, though, you get the good is never good enough. And Sarah Fillier has had a really good season this year. I think despite some of the goal-scoring issues throughout the year, she's easily been one of New York's best forwards. You could make a case that she's been New York's most important forward this season. Now, obviously, Kaltounkova could throw her hat in the ring for that conversation as well. You could mention O'Brien. But Sarah Fillier is really at the heart of everything that New York does offensively. If you watch a lot of times when they take it into the zone, it's Sarah Fillier carrying it in. She's really at the middle of everything they do offensively. That she's easily been one of their best forwards. But to hear someone like Fillier say, even though I've had a good season, like, it's not good enough. I've got more in the tank. I've got another level that I can reach. I mean, I think that perfectly encapsulates how a superstar thinks about the game and how their mindset operates, even through a 14-game goal drought. I think you're going to see Sarah Fillier be a little more active throughout this season. And it is important to note, and, Greg Fargo made sure to mention this when we were talking in January. Sarah's had to make a lot of adjustments this season. The first one is she's had a lot of different line mates. Last year she played a ton next to Alex Carpenter. Carpenter leaves in expansion. She's doing a good job with Seattle so far. And so, Philly's had a few different people. She's played with Kristen O'Neill, who's her Team Canada teammate. She's played with Peyton Levis, who's in her third year with the Sirens. She's played with some of the rookies, whether that's Kaltounkova or O'Brien or Tchaikovsky. So she's had to cycle through a lot of different line mates. The bigger adjustment, though, was she played center. She moved to center after 5 games into the season, played center through up until the Olympic break, and now they've moved her back to wing. From my perspective, I think Sarah profiles best as a winger, and that's where she's thrived at the professional level. That's where she plays with Team Canada, and if you see the stats with Team Canada, I think it makes a lot of sense. Greg Fargo had mentioned, she's honing into more of her defensive habits, and it's true that when you make the switch to center, a lot of times it's your responsibility to be the first forward back, so that it comes with more defensive responsibilities. Fillier wasn't really willing to put any merit into any of those talking points or excuses. I brought up the playing center stuff to her, and she said, especially offensively, like once you cross the red line, everything's kind of positionless, and so it didn't really change anything on my approach. The one thing she mentioned is breaking the puck out from the defensive zone. And when she's on the wing, she feels like she has more opportunities to catch a D on a 2-on-1. And if you've watched Fillier, you know how good she can be when she's on a 2-on-1 with that saucer pass across the ice. When she's playing center, she feels like a lot of times she's breaking the puck out through the middle of the ice and using her speed. So she's like, it's just 2 different looks. So Sarah wasn't really willing to put a ton of the reason on her goal-scoring drought onto changing positions or changing lines or anything like that. I do think she looks more comfortable on the wing, and I think there's more breakout opportunities for her on the wing. And from what I've seen so far post-Olympic break, it does feel like Greg Fargo is pretty dead set on keeping her at wing. It's been 3 straight games there, and even now, we'll get to the Casey O'Brien injury in just a second. Casey O'Brien was not on the ice this Wednesday when I went to practice, and even still, Fargo kept Fillier at wing, and that matters to me a lot, I think, because if you pay attention to how Greg Fargo uses his rotations, he really doesn't use his 4th line a ton, and he likes to lean on those top 3 lines. And so he likes to have a pretty deep middle, 1, 2, 3C. And the Sirens really only have, you'd say, 4 players who are capable of playing center and are also top 6 caliber skaters. And that's Fillier, O'Neill, O'Brien, and Kaltounkova. And, if O'Brien's out, you would think that, maybe Fargo would plug Fillier back into the middle. That's not what he did on Wednesday. He kept Fillier at wing, so I think the plan moving forward is to keep Sarah on her wing, and I think that should translate to better offensive production, even if Sarah isn't necessarily willing to chalk it up to that. Now, let's talk about injuries, because there were a couple in that Sunday game. New York ends up losing 2 forwards. The most notable one is Casey O'Brien, who's had a great rookie season. Late in the 3rd period, about 6 minutes left to go, she's carrying the puck in her own zone up one of the walls, and she takes this big hit along her back from Katerina Mrazova, and she goes headfirst into the wall. And so immediately, your big concern is head anything concussion-related, and neck, stemming from the impact when she hit the wall. She hits the wall with a lot of speed. It's a scary-looking collision. She's on the ice for over a minute. She's able to get up under her own power and with some help gets back to the locker room, but she didn't return. She wasn't on the ice Wednesday or Thursday. She's listed as day-to-day with an upper body injury. It's tough to tell with hockey players, right? Because you'll see them get into these like car accident collisions on the ice. And sometimes, right, we saw Sarah Fillier return during a game from one of those crazy big collisions. And she ends up missing a game, but it didn't end up being nearly as bad as it looked. So there's a world where Casey O'Brien plays Sunday, and she is truly day-to-day. It's also hockey. There's a world where she misses 2 to 3 weeks, and we don't really know what's wrong with her. I'm not going to play the guessing game here. I just think there's a very real possibility that she doesn't dress Sunday against Minnesota. It was a scary-looking collision. It's anything head-related, I think, is something that you have to be super cautious with, especially if there is any chance of a concussion. Always better to play that on the cautious side. But O'Brien's status at this point is really a question mark. We'll have a little more clarity on Sunday, but even then, we're not really going to get a ton until she's back on the ice if she does return. I would expect her to return this season just because I think if there was a chance that she was going to miss the whole season, I think they would have said week to week instead of day to day. But truly, we don't know. There can always be setbacks. Callie Shanahan, the rookie goalie, is also day-to-day, listed lower body. Probably explains why Kaylee Doyle had dressed as the backup against Boston and Ottawa. Talking about this hit from Razova, because there was some online discussion, I think it's worth getting into briefly. Madison Packer, who's a PWHL analyst and played for the Sirens during their inaugural season, thought it was a major in the moment. And she said a couple things that I wrote down. Number one was, even if the intent from Razova doesn't exist, even if there's not an intent to explicitly hurt or endanger O'Brien, you do have to have control going in, especially if you see the numbers in advance. You have to come in with control. The one thing she also said was she thought that Razova had time to make a decision and forego body contact there. So she ends up getting just the regular minor for a boarding penalty. I went back in the PWHL rulebook, and this is 41.1 in terms of deciding whether a boarding penalty is a minor or a major. And one of the lines that stood out to me, and I'll read it verbatim, is one of the things that matters is the circumstances of the check, including whether the opponent put herself in a vulnerable position. Now, I do think that O'Brien didn't help herself in this play. I don't think it's a great idea to skate up the wall with your back towards the center of the ice. It's not like, her numbers were completely perpendicular to center ice, but they're certainly tilted that way, and she does turn a little bit towards the end of that hit. I tend to agree with Packer that I think it's a dangerous hit. It's definitely a penalty, and it's one that Razova probably didn't have to deliver as firmly as she did. But if you're looking at O'Brien and saying, okay, well, she didn't really protect herself as best as she could, and she does make a little bit of a late turn, I have a tough time sometimes evaluating these penalties because it does feel sometimes like there's not a standard or consistent rule that they're holding it to. So I just wanted to put all that info out there. I think it's worth having a conversation about. Especially lately, I think Greg Fargo's been frustrated with some of the calls from officials lately. And he was pretty measured post-game. I think he tried to be really respectful, and he said, there's a really, really thin line here. The one thing he said is he just wants more clarity. He wants more of an explanation. And he's worried that they're riding the edge where players are starting to get hurt. So that was Fargo's input on everything. The other player that got injured late in the second period on Sunday was Peyton Levis. She took off the face-off, took a shot off the mask from Fillier. So Fargo said it clipped her on the year. She was a full skate at practice, so you can expect I expect Levis to be a full go on Sunday. So that's all the injury stuff out of the way. Again, O'Brien's the big one, because even though if you go on socials, and sometimes the Sirens will post their projected lines, and a lot of time Krista O'Neill is listed as the top line center, Casey O'Brien's been their top line center this year. As certainly as the season's gone along, you noticed a real shift after that hat trick against in Dallas against Seattle on December 28th. Ever since then, she's had a lot of confidence and a lot of swagger to her offensive game. But I mean, she's been a great 200-foot player. She's been awesome on faceoffs. And if you look at the time that Greg Fargo is giving her, I mean, she basically played 20 minutes in all but one game since the new year. She's got a couple back-to-back games where she played 1952. It's basically 20 minutes. So she's played a lot. She's had a couple games where she's up by the 25-minute mark. So she's played about as much as any Sirens forward has played this season, especially lately. So if they miss her for any stretch of time, that's going to be a big blow. What the lines looked like at practice on Wednesday without O'Brien, you had O'Neill and Kaltounkova as the top two centers, and then it was Vespa and Fecto. I think it'll be interesting to see how much play the third and fourth lines get, because we saw a similar look out of the Olympic break, except it was O'Brien at center and not Kaltounkova. And Greg Fargo didn't play Vespa and Fecto a ton. They got 7 minutes each. And after that, he switched back to a deeper line down the middle where he had O'Brien, O'Neill, and Kaltounkova. You don't really have, if O'Brien's hurt, you don't really have another go-to offensive contributor down the middle unless you want to move Fillier back to center. And I don't think that they do. So it'll be interesting to see what the lines look like moving forward. You might see, if O'Brien's hurt on Sunday, you might see Fargo really lean on those top two lines, the O'Neill line and the Kaltounkova line. It'll be curious to see, right? He already doesn't play that fourth line a ton. And if it's a third line centered by Kayla Vespa, historically he hasn't shown a ton of trust in a line anchored by one of his bottom six forwards. So, I mean, we'll see moving forward. Now, I think it's worth spending some time on Kaltounkova too, because she's played center the last two games. And that's an interesting switch to me. I think, like Fillier, she profiles long-term best on the wing. I think that's, a match made in heaven for her shot, the rocket shot that she has, and her offensive capabilities. But the Sirens really like what she does on the defensive end. I talked to Greg Fargo on Thursday, and Thursday against Boston, that was the first time that Kaltounkova had started at center since January 2nd. She got a couple starts back-to-back on the 31st of December and January 2nd, but she went 1 for 10 on faceoffs against Montreal, and we really hadn't seen the Sirens go back to that look with Kalty at center. They move her back on Thursday against Boston. They play her there again on Sunday. I like the line that they've put her with. It's Taylor Girard and Ann Cherkowski. I think that's a fun line. Girard and Kalty are a pretty good physical duo that I think they're fun, they're chippy. They've both had some pretty good goal-scoring touch this season, so I think that's a pretty good trio to run out there. But it was interesting to hear Fargo talk. It sounds like the main factor in that decision was how well he thinks Kaltounkova has played defensively, and how much he feels like it strengthens them down the middle. Now, again, those last two games, you also had O'Brien active, so you had those three really good, we'd call them top six centers down the middle. If O'Brien misses Sunday, that's a little more pressure on Kaltounkova. That's maybe more face-offs on the defensive end. Probably more playing time overall. I think you'll see her playing time skyrocket as she centers a line that's going to have to become more important. We're seeing her do a little bit better on faceoffs. She's 50% through 2 games, 11 for 22. As long as she can stay around that 50% mark, I think you're happy. You're not looking for Kaltounkova to be a faceoff wizard. There's so much stuff that she does during play that's going to make her a good fit to play center. I talked to her about the switch, And the one thing she said is, definitely more skating from college, right? She played center under Greg Fargo at Colgate. She primarily played center, just like Sarah Fillier primarily played center at Princeton. So it's not that she doesn't have experience. And in fact, over in February at the Olympics, she played center for Czechia. So she has experience playing down the middle. It's not like she's a fish out of water there. But she mentioned it's definitely more skating at this level. And she mentioned really wanting to embrace being more defensively responsible. And she said, I love my line. I think we're really good for covering for each other no matter what. But I do think when you're playing center, you have to take it upon yourself to be wary of breakouts and breakaways coming back the other way and be that first forward back. And so those are the little things that she's honing in on. The more interesting conversation with Kaltounkova is whether or not she has a target on her back. And it was brought up during the Sunday game, and I mentioned that double minor that she gets in the second period where she gets sent to the penalty box and the crowd erupts, and it's, kind of this cornerstone moment for me in that game of a moment of the crowd really establishing their presence. Kaltounkova remembers that moment less fondly because it gives Ottawa a power play. And I'll mention Crease Giants once again. They had a pretty funny tweet where he was like, Kaltounkova gets a double minor because her name is Kaltounkova. And if you go back and you watch that play, there's a lot of pushing and a lot of shoving. I'm not sure you see anything that makes Kaltounkova stand out above anyone else that was in that scrum, that she gets the double minor and Ottawa gets a power play. And I asked her on Wednesday, do you feel like you have a target on your back? And she said, yeah, absolutely. Now, she likes it when it's the opponents, and this is part of her game is she's a little bit of an instigator. She's trying to ruffle some feathers. She's trying to get people that when she's on the ice, you have to be on high alert of where's Kaltounkova on the ice? Is she going to come hit me? If I have the puck, I need to know where Kaltounkova is because she might get me. But she said, it's tough when it's the officials. And, you can't really control that. She feels like there are times when she's getting penalties even though she's not doing as much as other people are, or that sometimes she feels like she's doing less than other people are and getting penalized more harshly. And so she clearly is bothered by the fact that it feels like officials maybe have their eyes on her. I don't necessarily blame them. I think, listen, I do think when you look at some of the officiating this year that Kaltounkova's gotten a bad shake at times. I think certainly in that Sunday game, I don't think she deserved a double minor. But I'm also not surprised that opponents and officials alike are on high alert when she's on the ice. When we talk about Kaltounkova, it's not like this is an issue or a trend that's just out of the blue. She was one of the highest penalized players in college hockey. She finished top 5 in penalties in 3 of her 5 seasons at the D1 level. In 2 of those seasons, she was top 3 in the NCAA. So this is someone that has taken penalties throughout her career. I talked to her earlier in the season about it when very quickly she started to rack up some penalties. And she said, yeah, I want to be more mindful, but also this is my game. I play physical, I play aggressive, and I don't want to change that. And Greg Fargo echoed that. He's like, we don't want Kaltounkova to change the way she plays. We think that's an asset for us. We think that gives us an advantage. But that's going to come with penalties, and she had a couple big hits earlier in the season. Maybe the most memorable one, and maybe the one that earned her an early reputation, was that hit in the corner against Anna Wilgren against Seattle. New York ends up losing that game, in large part because Kaltounkova takes a major checking from behind penalty, gets ejected from the game, gives Seattle a lengthy power play. They end up scoring twice, and they win the game by 1. So that hit, I do think very early on, had officials on high alert about her. She's had a few big hits ever since, and if you watch a Sirens game and a scrum breaks down after the whistle, more often than not, Kaltounkova's in the mix there. And so whether it's fair or not, I think she 100% is going to have a target on her back from officials, and unless she changes the way that she plays, and I'm not endorsing that, and I don't think that she's going to, I do think that this is going to be part of the byproduct of her play style is that she's going to take a lot of penalties. She's going to draw a lot of fights from opponents. Opponents are going to target her specifically if they're trying to stir things up with the Sirens. She's 100% going to have a target on her back, and it's going to be from opponents and officials. And so that'll be interesting to see. Clearly, she's not happy about it on the officials' side of things, but I don't know that you can really change it unless she makes a major change to her play style. One last quick note on the playoff standings. There were some really interesting quotes from Boston Fleet head coach Chris Spar and Ottawa Charge head coach Carla McLeod this week about how the flow of the games are trying to shift a little bit. And Spar mentioned that as teams are clawing and scratching their way, for playoff spots, the physicality is going to increase. And the teams that are best capable of handling that physicality and are able to meet that physicality are the teams that are going to thrive and the teams that are going to make the playoffs. I raised that idea to Carla McLeod, and she had a little bit of a different take. She wasn't sure if it was completely the physicality. She just said, listen, this is competitive nature. We have a bunch of competitive athletes. A playoff berth is on the line. You're going to see the competitive nature start to rise. And Greg Fargo and McLeod both kind of echoed this, these points are really important and every game does matter. I think that's something to watch for in New York's last 11 games, is how physical these games are, how chippy they are. There's going to be a little extra edge here, and New York doesn't have a lot of room to breathe here. They got 1 point up on Ottawa for 4th place. Toronto, even though they've got a couple more, games played than the rest of the pack, Toronto is 2 points out of a playoff spot. So, listen, this is going to come down to the wire here. Now, if you're asking me to break this down and say, who's got the best chance, how does everything stack up? I think there's a clear drop-off after Boston, Montreal, and Minnesota at the top of the standings. I think those 3 teams are clearly the cream of the crop. At this stage of the season, I think anyone's guess whether it's Boston or Montreal that's going to be the top seed. Montreal is on a 6-game heater right now. Their shot rates and their even strength play look really good. Boston's offense, it is what it is at this stage of the season. They're not a super-powered offense, but they're elite defensively. They suffocate teams, and they've got a great goalie. So I think the number 1 seed, it's either Boston or Montreal. Minnesota, I think very clearly is going to be in the mix as well. And then there's a big drop-off. I put a lot of weight into goal differential. I think, especially once you have a big enough sample size, goal differential is usually a pretty good indicator of how good your team is and how dominant your team is. There are only 3 teams in the PWHL with the positive goal differential, and that's Boston, Montreal, and Minnesota. Off memory, I think it's Montreal plus 20, Minnesota plus 14, Boston plus 13. Everyone else is negative. Now, New York is the best of the rest, and I do think, they're a -4 goal differential in the season. I do think they're probably the best bet to get that 4th and final playoff spot. Ottawa's interesting. Ottawa's offense has really come alive, but they are what they are defensively. They've got a bad defensive system. They're really soft. They let up a lot of chances in between the circles. It's going to come down to, A, can they outscore their mistakes defensively, which they have a good enough offense to do, and B, can Gwyneth Phillips save their bacon on the other end? I think Ottawa's going to take it down to the wire. I think they'll be in it till the very last week. I do think that those defensive woes may be too much to overcome. So we'll see about that. I think New York's just a more well-balanced team when it comes to that. They're stronger in the defensive end. Maybe not as potent offensively as Ottawa, but they've still got a lot that excites you on the offensive end. Kaylee Osborne is not Gwyneth Phillips. I think they're on 2 different tiers right now when you're talking about PWHL goalies. Don't let Phillips' stats this season are not top of the league quality. But again, I think a lot of that is she's facing the most shots against in the league, and she's got the worst defense in the league in front of her. So I think she deserves a little bit of a pass there. Osborne gets better defensive play in front of her. So I don't think Osborne matches up to Phillips necessarily, but I think New York is a deeper and more well-rounded team, and they've played better hockey on the season. What Ottawa's good at, they're pretty good at. What they're bad at, they're pretty bad at. So you can kind of see it go either way. I think no matter what, they'll be in the mix. Toronto, I'm still skeptical. If we're talking goal differential, they're last in the league at -16. Right, they've kind of clawed their way back in here a little bit, but I don't necessarily trust their goaltending. I'm curious to see if their offense will settle into more of a form than I expected this year. I think they've really underperformed from what I expected of them when you looked at that roster on paper. I've yet to really buy into Toronto being a legit playoff contender at this stage. And with Vancouver and Seattle, Seattle's got the two big injuries. Bilka's out for the year. You don't know when Hillary Knight's coming back. And Vancouver's kind of just a disaster. So I think both of them still have enough time that if they went on a heater, they could get back into this conversation. But the sense time is kind of running out. And so they've got an uphill climb just to get back into the conversation. So I do think New York's in the best spot here to get that fourth playoff berth and get their first playoff appearance in team history. The one thing that maybe works against them is that road schedule. Again, 8 of 11 games are on the road to close out the year. They don't play another home game until April. That is something that kind of stacks against them, so it's not going to be easy. I really do think that this final playoff spot is probably going to be decided by, at most, 3 points. Yeah, I think Ottawa really gives New York a good run here. So that's going to translate to, I think, exciting, really fun hockey down the stretch. And that's all I got for this week. So, New York goes to Denver to play Minnesota this Sunday. They haven't beat Minnesota yet. Those are the things that I'm really looking for down the stretch is how did they stack up against Boston and Minnesota? They played Boston close. So I think you can hang your hat on that, even if they haven't beat them. They've got 2 really close games against Boston where you feel like, all right, at least they're in it. But I do think they've had a lot of problems with Boston defensively, especially in that last game. Boston can really suffocate you. Minnesota, you worry about the offense, right? That's an elite, deep offense. They scored 6 against New York the last time they played. This is another good benchmark for, all right, how legit is this Sirens team, right? I think they can get into the playoffs. I don't think they're on the same caliber yet as Boston, Minnesota, Montreal. I think that's okay. I had this tabbed more as a transitional year, maybe the year where they get close to a playoff berth but fall just short, and it sets up the season after that where New York really blossoms. I think New York's ahead of schedule. Kaltounkova's quickly become one of the top goal scorers in the league. Casey O'Brien, if she's healthy, is a game-changing top-line center. So they're ahead of schedule. I think they're a really good bet to make the playoffs. How deep can they go? I think that will be an uphill battle, and that's a conversation for they gotta get there first, right? They can't even think about how deep can we get in the playoffs. You just gotta get there first, and that starts with I'd like to see them play a team like Minnesota close. I'd like to really see what they can do, how they stack up against that offense. So that's what I'm watching for. I'm gonna try and do this semi-frequently. I try to go to Sirens practice at least once a week. I'm there at all the home games. All my articles are on sportsnot.com/PWHL. I'll throw the link in here as well. In terms of my content, I mainly on Twitter. A lot of my quotes and my analysis and my articles go up on Twitter. I'll post some of my articles to Blue Sky, but if you're looking for the everyday live beat coverage, most of that stuff's on Twitter for me. But I'm going to try and branch out and do some more video content moving forward. We'll try to do this semi-frequently. But yeah, that's it. This has been the first episode of Siren Sounds, and hopefully many more to come. So I'm Lou Orlando. Take care, everybody.